Good afternoon, everyone, at least for those of you in Europe or in the vicinity of Helsinki. My name is Ville Sinkonen. It's my honor to chair this final installment of Connectivity Conversations. Today's event is entitled Multi-Layered Connectivity in Practice, Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific in Southeast Asia. And like I mentioned, this event concludes the Connectivity Conversation series, which has been part of our FIA project on super regionalism and contentious connectivity in Asia. And I have the honor to present today's speaker, Ren Jenny Lindgren. Ren is a senior research fellow and head of Center for Asian Research at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, so our sister institute. And she's also an associate research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, UI, which is another sister institute of ours. Ren's main research interests are foreign policy legitimation, international relations in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, the politics and foreign policy of Japan, and Arctic diplomacy. And her recent projects have focused on Japan's foreign and security policy legitimation, infrastructure power, and responses to China's Belt and Road Initiative, evolving Japan-NATO relations, Japan-Russia energy cooperation, identity politics in Sino-Japanese relations, Japan's engagement in Myanmar, and alternative alignments in the Indo-Pacific. Since joining NUPI in 2013, Ren has also worked on issues related to Asia-Arctic diplomacy, and she currently leads a multi-year project, Roads to Power, the political efforts of infrastructural projects in Asia, or ROADS, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council. And as our discussant today, my esteemed colleague, Bart Jans. Bart is a leading researcher here at FIA in the Global Security Research Program. And from May 2021 until April 23, he has led a project on connectivity in the Indo-Pacific region, i.e. the project which we are now in the process of concluding with this webinar. There will also be a public event in the summer to commemorate the end of the project and some of the work that we've done within the rubric of the project. But without further ado, I will yield the floor to Ren. So please take us away on the free and open Indo-Pacific.
Thank you so much, Villa, for that kind introduction. And I will try to share my slides with you first. Okay. Thank you again, Villa, for that kind introduction, and also to Bart for the invitation to contribute to this very timely and exciting series on connectivity conversations. The topic that I will be covering today is multi-layered connectivity in practice, Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific in Southeast Asia. This may be a newer term of connectivity to some in the audience, and also thank you to the audience for tuning in from near and far. And it has actually been a newer term for me as well. I first encountered it when Japan released the update of its free and open Indo-Pacific in March 2023. So today what I would like to do is speak a little bit about what this term really entails, how it's perhaps different from previous versions of connectivity that have been promoted in Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific, and also talk not in a great deal, but at least giving an overview of some of the main kind of practices and projects focused in the Southeast Asian region in the 10 ASEAN economies. So just to begin, I would like to introduce the term connectivity. I mean, we hear more and more about connectivities these days, I think it's fair to say, and kind of a way of thinking about it could be that we're taking a turn to connectivity. We talk often in the IR, international relations world, about different terms, a turn to diplomacy, a turn to emotions, a turn to connectivity. And there's also, I know, been reference to this in some recent articles that have been published on connectivity from good colleagues at FIA. And so I think we understand connectivity as being a rather simple term, but also something that has developed meaning as it is put into practice and as it has gone from being a buzzword to more of an academic field of study. And this, of course, is important to clarify because connectivity, in a way, it may seem simple, but it's actually quite complicated when you think about the different types of connectivity and the different attributes related to these types of connectivity. So some connectivity has, much more tactical, physical features, such as infrastructure connectivity. Other types of connectivity is less tactical. It's more people-to-people connectivity, also known as perhaps human connectivity. We hear also a lot about digital connectivity these days, and really multi-layered connectivity engages with all of these terms. And this is a new dimension of connectivity. It was introduced as one of the pillars in Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific in March 2023. There are a total of 4 pillars. And so it has a significant place in this policy. And today I'd like to speak a little bit about how it is explained, both from the point of view from the Japanese government, but also how we as researchers and outsiders can perhaps understand what this relates to in terms of global developments, and particularly in the ASEAN region, what this means. But first, I would like to start with a visual of what the Indo-Pacific is, because I know this is not always straightforward. And as you can see here in this great map that was developed by SWP last year, the Indo-Pacific really is not only one understanding, it's not only one region, it's not only one geographic space. There are a number of understandings of where the Indo-Pacific starts and stops. And in the case of Japan, they really take a broader, larger view. Here, Japan's idea of what the Indo-Pacific region entails is the blue circle, the blue oval. And as you can see, it's really at the ends of the geographic space that's covered, and it's spanning Asia and Africa, but also importantly, 2 oceans, the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So this is a broader framing of what the Indo-Pacific is. And I think, some wonder really, what is the policy of the Indo-Pacific? Because we have this geographic space of the Indo-Pacific, but for Japan, what is this policy and why do we hear so much about it since it's been launched in 2016? Is this Japan's grand strategy? Is a question that I have encountered a few times. And I think it's fair to say that this is a core part of Japanese foreign policy today and has been a core part of Japan's presentation to the world of the kinds of values and economic initiatives and also people-to-people exchange it wants to promote. But it also links back to some of the main underpinning factors of Japan's grand strategy, which is about, of course, maintaining the balance of power in the face of a rising China, meeting international challenges, particularly more these days. We hear more about the implications of Russia's war in Ukraine for Japan and the security situation in the immediate region around Japan. It's also about bringing in economic prosperity, peace, and stability into the region. And this jives really, it coincides with a number of other important documents that Japan has been updating just over the past 6 months. Its main core strategic documents that I would argue combined create a kind of grand strategy for Japan. But if we're to focus just on FOIP for a moment and talk about its evolution, I think there's a couple of key points here. One is that FOIP, when it was first announced in 2016, Abe, former Prime Minister Abe, had announced it at a TICAD summit in Nairobi, Kenya. It was presented as a strategy. And so there was obviously a strategic element. There was a lot of broad statements without much content. It left a lot of people wondering, what does this actually mean? What does this fill in? Is this something new? And over the years, Japan really worked more with the concept to try to hone in on what it meant in practice and how others could understand Japan's FOIP. And this started kind of a campaign to call it more of a vision or even an effort, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. That's one of MOFA's PowerPoint presentations on the Indo-Pacific. But more recently, since FOIP has been introduced in 2023, it's actually taken another identity. And FOIP 2.0 is very much about expanding cooperation, not just within the framework of the previous FOIP 1.0, but also in terms of allowing for anyone really in the world to think about FOIP as a visionary concept, not just Japan, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but all over the globe. And so we see a much broader attempt to create an understanding of FOIP being what someone described to me as a mindset. And this is a MOFA-led, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs-led initiative primarily. But as you can see at the top left side of the screen, there has been other approaches defined by other ministries. In particular, last year, the Ministry of Defense had given kind of a take on what they see as being their contributions to FOIP and how it aligns with their objectives. A major part of FOIP is about, of course, fostering regional stability and prosperity, but through doing this, it's about connectivity. And here you see a map that has Japan in red, because Japan in this setting is the main FOIP player. The partners in FOIP that Japan sees as kind of allies in pursuing the values and the developments that FOIP hopes to pursue are in green. In blue, and in green is the 4 areas that are of great interest and focus in Japan's FOIP. And I would say the main area of focus for Japan's FOIP, the area that we will speak about today, is Southeast Asia, but also the importance of South Asia for further connectivity on to Africa and the Middle East, and increasingly discussions about the Pacific Islands and their importance in FOIP. So I would like to just introduce some of the pillars that were part of the first FOIP in order for you to understand the evolution on connectivity and the understanding of connectivity in Japan's FOIP. So in its first FOIP from 2016, connectivity was bedded into its second pillar of the pursuit of economic prosperity. So improving connectivity was part of this. And here the focus was really on high quality infrastructure of investment. And the high quality part is always emphasized in Japan's diplomatic engagement, explaining why it promotes infrastructure development, and it especially kind of emphasizes the values, free, transparent, standard meeting infrastructure in promoting what it thinks is important in terms of hard infrastructure in different geographic spaces within the FOIP context. And here ASEAN has really been a heart and hub in focus, and Japan has 2 economic corridors that it focuses on, one spanning from Da Nang in Vietnam through Cambodia and Thailand into Myanmar, and another from Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam through Cambodia and Thailand as well into Dawei, Myanmar. And they put a number of strategic economic zones, developing these to try to also generate business opportunities to promote these corridors of connectivity. But I have to say, one thing that struck me in the first FOIP was there was very much a kind of distinction between high quality infrastructure investment, physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, railways, and then also the non-physical or the less tangible connectivity, such as human to human connectivity, knowledge connectivity, education, training, and friendship. And I think a major difference now is we see through multi-layered connectivity that these 2 have been brought together, and there's a discussion now on how they serve one another. So this is the 2016 version again. Moving into the 2023 version, which was just released in March, multi-layered connectivity came up as one of the core pillars, the 3rd pillar. And when we talk about multi-layered connectivity, I mean, it may seem in some ways obvious to the listener that it has different aspects and different layers, but really how this differs from what we just talked about in the 2016 version of connectivity is something that I'd like to go into more detail on. The core element here is that it's part of, cooperation with FOIP, and it's viewed as one of the main pillars. So it's very important actually for promoting Japan and promoting what Japan sees as important connectivity patterns, not only for Japanese national interests, but also for the development of the ASEAN region and also the South Asian region. So we see in the language that I've reviewed on multi-layered connectivity and FOIP, one word that I had noticed and encountered a few times is this idea that multi-layered connectivity is an effort to help other countries overcome their vulnerabilities through initiatives that further enhance connectivity. And in the second paragraph here, the second quote here, it's actually taken from a speech that Prime Minister Kishida gave in New Delhi when he was launching FOIP 2.0. And here he says, no matter how times may change, we're always going to need economic growth. And the growth of these countries needs to be able to be staying connected in various aspects, but we really need to be careful to make sure that countries are not a breeding ground for political vulnerability. I'm obviously paraphrasing here. So this idea of vulnerabilities and connectivity helping countries that could be potentially vulnerable is a theme that I see more in this FOIP 2.0 than in the first version. And we can discuss later perhaps how that relates back to a number of other values that Japan promotes. But I want to talk about first the three areas that are in focus for multi-layered connectivity. One relates to what we've been talking about already, and those are the efforts to enhance connectivity in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So basically to further those initiatives. But what's new really is this idea of knowledge connectivity and how to make human connectivity front and forward in this initiative. And this involves both youth initiatives with long-standing initiatives receiving more support, both in financial terms and in terms of capacity, but also knowledge and experience. So like exchanges of researchers, exchanges of experts, and also the business aspect, connecting entrepreneurs and investments. So we see that the connectivity of knowledge is not just limited to one sector, it's trying to take a multi-sector approach. And perhaps not surprisingly, another area in focus is digital connectivity. And here Japan, of course, is doing a lot in all of its documentation to promote digital connectivity, not just at a national level, but also at an international level. And here, again, the values of promoting open and reliable digital technology are emphasized. And there's both, of course, the physical aspect of digital connectivity through sea cables, for instance, undersea sea cables, developing those, but also the information that is transmitted through those cables. So I thought it would be helpful to also think about how multi-layered connectivity is working in practice. And here I've listed some of the initiatives that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had given as case examples for multi-layered connectivity. We unfortunately don't have so much time today, so I will only go into a few of these, the three that are highlighted in green. And the first relates to ASEAN connectivity. And the point of this picture is for you to see, again, where the red circles are the two main points of connectivity initiatives within Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific. One is geared towards South Asia and one is geared towards ASEAN connectivity. And actually, these complement each other and they're not totally separate. So you could also consider that they're one broader connectivity initiative. But within the context of multi-layered connectivity, we have been given examples of structural cooperation and non-structural cooperation. And here the idea of structural cooperation really relates back to the hard infrastructure, right? The bridges, roads, tunnels, ports, the making of those, and also meeting the standards and needs that are required in order to meet the high quality aspect of Japan's infrastructure. So you can see here there's a number of activities going on between the two different economic corridors that Japan focuses on in ASEAN. But we also have significant non-structural cooperation. And I think this is something that is highlighted much more in the FOIP that came out in March 2023. Here we see, ironically, a lot of connection to non-structural cooperation on structural cooperation. And by this, I mean capacity building on the hard infrastructure that Japan is also contributing to building. So it's kind of a two-step approach where we see that Japan is not just building a port or helping develop a port or logistics in the port, but also they're providing advisors to help on the ground, explain to people how the port should use, how it should be maintained, what is the best way to take care of the materials they're using to make them have a longer livelihood, these kinds of discussions. And so we see this in many of the Southeast Asian countries. There's a long list if you look online, but I think some of the ones that really stood out, of course, relate to hard infrastructure projects such as rail planning, road planning, and often capacity building related also to customs, which is, of course, more of a human-to-human, non-tangible form of connectivity. And Japan also, have to say, really adjust its approach to connectivity, and that there's a various degree of development among the 10 economies of ASEAN. And so we see the initiatives are really fit to meet kind of the level of development in each of the ASEAN countries. So in this case, for instance, with Singapore, Japan's focus is more on a partnership program where they can look at supply chain resilience, border control over all of ASEAN, and port management, sharing best practices, whereas other countries, perhaps it's more kind of local, on the ground, road planning and management. And Japan exports special advisors to these regions to help with the non-structural cooperation. When it comes to the enhancement in knowledge connectivity, that again is one of the newer kind of pushes in FOIP 2.0, we see a big focus on youth and the importance of generating more youth exchange between ASEAN countries and Japan. And in doing this, they encourage not only student exchanges in terms of academic exchanges, but also the idea of research exchanges. So perhaps some of us in the audience, like myself, are also researchers. So really, we would be the targets of these fellowships, FOIP fellowships for researchers. But this is, of course, between ASEAN countries and Japan. And it also goes onwards to talk about tourism as a major area of collaboration and human-to-human connectivity in promoting relations between Japan and ASEAN countries in terms of knowledge connectivity. The last focus area that I wanted to talk about relates to the development and operation of overseas ports to attract Japanese companies. And I have to say, this really stood out in the documentation, the long list of different types of examples, because it was clear that this was an initiative for ASEAN, but also really an initiative to attract the Japanese companies, the Japanese business interests, the national interests in Japan, and having access to strategic points, and also other options should certain sea lanes of communication perhaps, or sea lines of communication perhaps, be obstructed. So Japan explains that they're trying to propose the know-how of the industry-oriented port development overseas, so that the Japanese government will help Japanese companies engage in developing and operating the local points and expand their business in the port and its hinterland. And two examples that are provided are in Pantaban Port in Indonesia, which is at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. This is a port that has been developed using Japanese ODA, and actually there are a number of Japanese automakers that are producing vehicles and exporting them from this port. And another example is the Lac Nguyen port in Vietnam, which also recently just opened and is a major point of business, a major point of interest for Japanese businesses in export and import trade. So if we consider these three aspects, they all relate back to ASEAN and Japan, and how Japan is trying to push the idea of multilateral connectivity. But I think it's also important to understand from the ASEAN perspective where the interests lie here, if this is something that is of the same level of reception in the ASEAN community. And I think doing that, of course, is more difficult now on the ground locally. But I think policy-wise, we see a lot of synergy between Japan's FOIP and ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I think, as I mentioned previously, ASEAN collaboration is understood as the core. It's the heart and hub of Japan's FOIP, so it's essential. And it is also understood as essential because it is such a dynamic region. The 10 economies making up for a huge percentage of the world population, considered the growth engine of the world by Prime Minister Kishida. So the importance of ASEAN in Japan's foreign policy and in many other countries' foreign policy should not be underestimated. But how much does ASEAN really want to sign on to this kind of connectivity? Is it of interest? What are some of the challenges? I think a lot of these topics have been discussed in great detail, especially in relation to other initiatives, for instance, China's Belt Road Initiative. But in terms of Japan's engagement with ASEAN, we see a lot of positivity. There is, of course, a huge rate of trust. Japan is one of the most trusted countries in ASEAN. And so they see connectivity also as an area of cooperation. And Japan's FOIP, in a way, reflects ASEAN's FOIP and ASEAN's initiative on connectivity, which targets 2025 as an important year. So I think there's many opportunities for synergy, but especially now, given that ASEAN and Japan are about to celebrating, I guess, technically already, we're in 2023, they're 50 years of friendship and cooperation. And what this means for the FOIP and the initiatives that I have mentioned today is additional funding to support this kind of integration and the connectivity issues, especially on human-to-human connectivity, but also the idea that there will be a summit in Tokyo towards the end of the year where a new vision for cooperation will be established. And I am positive that there will be a lot of elements from both Japan's FOIP and ASEAN's AOIP incorporated into this new vision. But for now, the cooperation that they're really looking to strengthen is in the main priority areas, which relate to maritime cooperation, connectivity, SDGs, economic connectivity as well, and also a number of FOIP initiatives related to supply chain, digital connectivity, food security. So it's not surprising what they're working with, but again, I think the focus now is really more towards the human-to-human connectivity aspect, the intangible assets that humans can be for promoting FOIP. I wanted to also talk about what the role of FOIP is in Japan's broader policy context, because as I mentioned at the beginning, it can be a bit unclear whether or not this is Japan's grand strategy or something else. And I think it's important to say that it is a part of Japan's bigger approach, but it's not maybe the only thing. And there's two other significant developments that link to this. One is the upcoming revision of Japan's Development Cooperation Charter, basically its ODA charter, which was last revised in 2015. Since then, there's been significant developments both in Japan's foreign policy, for instance, the introduction of FOIP 1.0 and now 2.0. But also a number of developments concerning engagement in Southeast Asia and Africa, another focus of Japan's ODA. And we see in the current draft of the charter, which is out for review, it's in Japanese, but it's under review, and I think they're expecting to actually release the charter just in the next weeks, a focus on geopolitical competition, much more so than in the 2015 document. We see discussions about widening economic disparities and also a lack of debt sustainability in loans by emerging donor countries, right? So not saying exactly who this could be referring to, but I think we can guess that this has something to do with the idea of debt traps and the challenges that they impose for countries that don't have a good economic situation to begin with, or are challenged in trying to find the means to land certain contracts on fair terms. And then the second part of the policy apparatus that really supports FOIP, but also is major, is related to the security documents that Japan has been releasing. Japan released 3 and, well, really 4 significant security documents in late 2022, mapping out the plan to improve defense capabilities significantly over the next 5 to 10 years. This involves a budget increase in defense from 1% to 2%. We see that there is a number of initiatives for different types of acquisitions in the defense buildup plan and program. And we also see the national security strategy being much more vocal about the idea that we are facing a point in history now that is really a turning point with Russia's war in Ukraine and the potential that such war could have a spillover effect in the region around Japan. And so the need for Japan to protect itself at an unprecedented level is really heavily marketed in all of these strategies, and they have great synergy with FOIP and also increasingly with the development charter, which has taken on a much more security hue. So one might ask is if this is actually really the securitization of FOIP. We see that this is linking more and more to defense policy topics. We said the Ministry of Defense has also made their idea of what FOIP is and how it engages with their work. So I think this is a moving area of interest for those of us following FOIP, and also developments related to development cooperation. So finally, I'd just like to say a few words about where this potentially could be going. Unfortunately, we didn't have so much time today to go into great detail, but FOIP is basically an evolving policy. It coincides with the fact that Japan is taking a larger international security role, trying to take more of a leadership role, I would argue, in some contexts in the East Asian region, but also especially at the multilateral level, hosting big meetings such as the G20 and now the G7, very engaged in UN activities. So we see that Japan is really making sure its presence is visibly seen and also its messages are heard. But we also see in the documents a clear strategy in linking different types of foreign policy together. And I would also argue even domestic policy, and more distinction in what Japan can contribute with and where Japan is maybe perhaps suited to providing analysis, but also providing things like quality infrastructure in certain parts of the world. And Satake in 2019 wrote an interesting article explaining that he thinks the FOIP, is focusing primarily on balancing connectivity and order building. And I think I agree with many of his arguments, pointing out that Southeast Asia is key for connectivity and balancing, but that this will eventually go on to other regions. And that really is the idea of FOIP, right? You start in Southeast Asia, you try to work on the initiatives there that will then connect you to South Asia, continue working on initiatives there, which will then connect you to the eastern part of Africa, an area that Japan is still very much trying to learn how to engage with, and it hopes to build knowledge and competence on this by moving through South Asia from Southeast Asia, and in particularly India is an important player here. But where does multi-layered connectivity look to be going in the coming years? I think already this is a very new term. So first, we're going to just have to spend some time digesting it and understanding what it really is about. I think, ideally for the Japanese government, this is a term that they hope catches on, just as FOIP does, so that there's some kind of adoption of the concept in other policy papers, not just in Japanese context, but perhaps in the US context, or in the context of close partners in the Indo-Pacific, such as Australia. So to try to really get this concept and the understanding of it to spread. Also honing in on the practices of multilateral connectivity, really, as these new programs are launched, especially related to knowledge connectivity and human-to-human connectivity. Where can we identify multi-layered connectivity versus traditional other types of connectivity? I think this will be a challenge for Japan because in many ways, multi-layered connectivity, it can be argued, is nothing new. It's just some new projects within broad connectivity terms. And finally, I think, as I mentioned before, that Japan has a multi-step approach to reaching different geographic spaces. And right now, a lot of the literature about multi-layered connectivity is focused on the ASEAN region and some on the South Asia region. But I think the next obvious step would be to see more examples of how this plays out in Japan's engagement in Africa within the FOIP context. So there will be certainly more FOIPs coming up. I don't think anytime soon, but eventually I'm sure there'll be a FOIP 3.0, as well as a number of other documents that will support FOIP and continue to forward the message of connectivity and its importance. So where we see it going in the coming years will be very exciting. And with that, I would like to thank you and turn back to Ville.
Thank you so much, Ren. That was a wide-ranging look at the two FOIPs and waiting for the third. Now, please do post your questions in the chat box, something I neglected to mention at the start. This was certainly an interesting presentation that I'm sure will you'll have a lot of questions on your mind. But before that, I will now turn to Bart for his comments on Ren's presentation and perhaps a few pointed questions in Ren's direction as well. Please, Bart.
Thank you very much, Ville, and thank you also very much, Ren, for this elucidating presentation on multi-layered connectivity. Now, I think that connectivity itself is quite a comprehensive and very vague term that has been applied in fields from infrastructure to economy, institutions, knowledge exchange, people to people, and so on. So you can say that connectivity by nature, by itself, is already multi-layered. So multi-layered connectivity might seem like a pleonasm, or almost a redundancy of words there. Anyway, I think your presentation helped us a lot to get a better understanding of how Japan then fills in this concept. And that is by focusing on infrastructure development, knowledge connectivity, and digital. Now, I have one comment and 3 questions for you. First one is about the FOIP as Japan's grand strategy, or at least as part of Japan's grand strategy. Because I do think that it's fair to say that FOIP has evolved into, well, if you want, a multi-layered, to stick with the jargon, overarching vision of Japan's foreign and security policy, because exactly it has ramifications in so many other domains. Now, connectivity domain is already quite obvious, and that has been discussed. I think there's also very strong links with the normative domain, with values and norms, because FOIP is also about trying to shape the region's rules, norms, and expectations through this concept. And for example, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Japan has been saying that, well, the world is lacking a guiding perspective that is acceptable to everybody, to the international order, and FOIP can offer that perspective. There's also clear links with economy. So economically, FOIP allows Japan to link connectivity with so-called quality infrastructure investment, which for them offers an alternative to the Chinese model. And Prime Minister Kishida has said that, well, if you only rely on one model, that can be or one player involved, that can be a breeding ground for political vulnerability if countries only rely on one external player. And that is obviously an obvious hint to China. Also, further in the realm of economy, FOIP allows Japan to take on a leadership position in free trade in the region, especially after arguably the US has retreated from free trade as an overarching idea, and has retreated from constructions like the TPP. There's also links with security, between FOIP and security, obviously, because Japan is very eager to strengthen strategic partnerships with so-called like-minded partners. So Japan has been very active in this domain, trying to make these partnerships with Australia, India, countries in the ASEAN region, also in Europe, and lately also has been trying to strengthen cooperation with NATO. That tendency to make friends and partners is also quite strong in the case of Japan in the global south, especially through a new thing that Japan has come up with, and that is called official security assistance, or OSA. And that was only introduced this year also or last year in December, in the last update of the security policy. Now, this allows Japan to give, in a more easy way, funding to other countries to buy, for example, patrol boats, to build up infrastructure, and to provide capacity building support, including maritime law enforcement capabilities. So security links, and finally there's also links with development cooperation, with ODA, because Japan is through FOIP vastly expanding its ODA, and Kishida has been emphasizing the strategic usage of ODA there, promising further $75 billion, I think it was, in public and private funds by 2013 in infrastructure development in the Indo-Pacific. So that's my comment. I think I do believe that multi-layered connectivity is certainly an important part of the new FOIP, but FOIP itself should be seen as Japan's multi-layered strategic vision as for foreign and security policy. Then I have 3 questions for you. First one is, well, it's quite clear from your presentation that Japan is a major player in the field of connectivity. And if you think about it, Japan has been a connectivity superpower already long before the term connectivity came into vogue, and certainly long before China launched its BRI. That's clear in Southeast Asia, where Japan's investments are probably still larger than China's. There are initiatives that you mentioned, the Japan-ASEAN connectivity initiative, transport corridor development, and so on. There is South Asia, where Japan is very active. Think about subway development in India, or the efforts to create an industrial value chain connecting the Bay of Bengal and the northeastern region of India. So there's all these activities on the ground. There's also the ideational influence that Japan has been having, and just the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a region can arguably be traced back to well, a speech given by former Prime Minister Abe in 2007, and also the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific is actually or has been very strongly promoted successfully, I would say, by Japan. So in spite of all these achievements, both on the ground and in ideational terms, I think you can say that Japan is not so widely known as a connectivity superpower and has remained quite low key, and is certainly much less known than China's BRI, for example. So my question is, why is that? Is it just a matter of branding, or is there more at play here? Second short question is about inclusiveness. If you look at FOIP 2.0, I think what stands out also is that inclusiveness is emphasized more than in the first version. And perhaps Japan feels a need to also not entirely exclude China, that there is a need for engagement with China. There was a summit last year in November. This year is also the 50th anniversary of the normalization of bilateral relations between Japan and China. There may have been pressure from ASEAN as well as India, who very much emphasize this inclusive nature of the Indo-Pacific regional concept. So my question is, what is your take on this? To what extent is FOIP, as well as multi-layered connectivity, about containing China? And to what extent is there scope for cooperation and engagement with Beijing? And then finally, my question is about FOIP's basis in values and norms. FOIP obviously has a very strong normative basis, like I already said, and Japan has been emphasizing these norms and values in order to create a so-called coalition of the willing with countries that stick to similar values, like the rule of law, free trade, open sea lanes, diversity, and so on. But at the same time, I have a feeling that Japan has been toning down the emphasis on values like democracy and human rights, simply because it compromises them. Because if you emphasize these values too much, then you end up straining relations with countries that fill in these concepts and values in a different way that we do in the West. So it can even have an opposite or an adverse effect, as these counterpart countries may then engage with countries that are more pragmatically inclined. So I know that you have been working in Myanmar. So how would you say that Japan has tried to deal with this tension between rhetoric and reality, let's say? I think you did some interviews in the Tilawa special economic zone in Myanmar. Have you been able to observe this tension as for values and sometimes the clashes with reality on the ground? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Bart, for the great comment, and also the questions. They're all really interesting, and some questions I've pondered a bit myself. So if we start with your first question about kind of the ideational pull of Japan's FOIP, and perhaps why it hasn't been as effective as one would imagine, considering the types of resources and international messaging and pickup that it has gotten, and especially, like you said, in comparison to the BRI branding that we've seen. And I think I have two thoughts about this. I mean, one really depends on what audience you're asking in terms of knowing about Japan's FOIP and knowing about the values it pushes. I think if you ask those of us sitting in Europe, you would get a different answer than if you asked people sitting in Southeast Asia, for instance, right? Because the influence of, for instance, FOIP is much more palpable in a region like Southeast Asia than it is, for instance, here. So I think one thing is, who you're asking in terms of catch on. But I have to say also Japan has, in a way, been able to make the FOIP term really be something that has been adopted in various contexts. So we hear more about, especially not necessarily FOIP, but the Indo-Pacific, right? And a number of European countries have also adopted their own Indo-Pacific policies, France, Germany, the EU as well. And so we see that it is a term that is picking up. I don't think it has picked up so well in the Nordic context, at least in Norway, I can say. But it is something that we think about as an alternative, along with a number of other initiatives that Japan is part of. So even if it's not FOIP, the other alternatives that we speak about to the BRI, the other kinds of options to perhaps confront what Japan is terming as vulnerabilities, either economic or political, usually engage with Japan. And why is that? Well, because they're often US-led, and the US is one of Japan's closest allies on security terms, but also on economic terms. And also they're led multilaterally, right? So in thinking about Japan's multilateral engagement and thinking about its own FOIP and thinking about its close connection to the US and thinking about the menu of options confronting the BRI, I think Japan really stands out actually as one of the main engagers, one of the main players. But also, I think another thought here is it could be just like a matter of time and more engagement. I mean, the BRI, in a way, it was officially announced by Xi Jinping 10 years ago, but the BRI started before the BRI was announced, basically. And you could argue that also FOIP started before FOIP was announced, but just generating the knowledge about it and the experiences that one has with these different and significant infrastructure initiatives, I think lends to different profiles. And the BRI initiatives have been very much a discussion of challenges, I think, less so about progress. It really depends on the context. Of course, there are many successful BRI projects as well, but we've gotten a lot of new terminology that is actually quite, negative in its connotation related to the BRI, such as debt trap diplomacy. And we don't really necessarily have that so much when it comes to FOIP. So that can also have an effect on how I think these different initiatives are perceived and understood. Moving on to your second question about whether or not FOIP is really about inclusiveness, right? Because this is something that is pushed very strongly in FOIP 2.0. What is the, possibility for cooperation really at a practical level, or is this really about containing China? And there's an interesting term that I came across recently that's actually from business, and it's called co-petition. And it's basically the idea of cooperation, but also competition. And I think in some ways this describes what FOIP is going for. In a way, it's providing another alternative to China, but a number of other actors. And that way it's competing, but also it's saying, we're inclusive, and we are not excluding anyone. We are not creating camps. We are not imposing values. This is verbatim what Prime Minister Kishida has pitched. And we see that there's softer rhetoric in the current FOIP, also relating to values, but more about inclusivity. One can question really how this operates in practical terms, because it's not the first time that Japan and China have tried to cooperate or potentially cooperate or discuss projects in Southeast Asia. There was another case of this, I think it was 2018, around where Japan and China had signed on to working together on a number of projects in Southeast Asia on practical terms, and it just in practice didn't work out. It wasn't even able to be launched. That said, I think there is a lot of local engagement between Japan and China. Sometimes there's Chinese construction companies that are helping with Japanese bids and tenders, and there is, of course, exchange relating to different physical infrastructure and its planning. So to say that there's no cooperation, I think would be not accurate, but at the same time, I think the best term to kind of capture this really is this co-petition idea, where you strive for some points of cooperation, but really you have a lot of competition and a lot of pushback in the values domain. Which brings me to your third question, which is about FOIP's basis in values and norms, and the fact that FOIP is, or perhaps in this new version of FOIP, these are toned down a bit, and how this plays out on the ground. And I can give some reflections on my fieldwork in Myanmar. But first, I would just like to say, I think you're absolutely right. We see a toning down of the values-based push that has been really a trademark of the diplomatic paradigms that brought forth FOIP, right? The arc of freedom and prosperity, there's in the 2000s, but also a number of other kind of initiatives, such as the proactive contribution to peace. And the softer rhetoric is really emphasizing inclusivity in this new FOIP. And they're using a lot of the same terms, but maybe perhaps not as often, right? It's more like situated in strategic parts of the document, not just reiterated all the time. But there's obviously peace, freedom, transparency, rule of laws as values, and these are the values that Japan has constantly pushed, but it's done in a softer way. And this is probably to cater to ASEAN states, right, who generally do not want to choose sides, who generally also have to manage their relationships with China and other great powers, and are not able to sign on as wholeheartedly when such strong values are pushed. So I think that is a significant difference. And I think in the context of Myanmar, well, it's a difficult case to really speak about now, considering the situation on the ground in Myanmar. But I think already there was some kind of reception of these values to some degree from some groups, especially business communities. But in practice, how realistic they are in carrying out projects, I think, is difficult. And in the case of this special economic zone, for instance, I mean, within the economic zone, you're dealing with a peaceful environment where they promote freedom and transparency in their operations, and they have high environmental standards. But the reality is, right outside the economic zone, you face environments that are completely different from that. But FOIP doesn't just end in this economic zone, right? Japan's FOIP is also projected to other parts of Myanmar, other initiatives confronting BRI projects, also trying to sometimes cooperate with them. And so I think the challenge now is finding ways for these values, especially given the challenging political situation that Myanmar is in with the ongoing war, to find opportunities to make the values that are now coming off softer more realistic in environments that are not fully controlled by Japan or fully controlled by China, but kind of these merged environments. So yeah, I think that's those are my reflections on those questions. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Ren. Really good answers. A lot of interesting reflections. I think you touched on the two questions that we have in the chat, but we've got 5 minutes. So you now have 5 minutes to reflect on two things. One is, how does the FOIP that Japan pushes for relate to the EU's Global Gateway? And relatedly, how do the different ideas of the Indo-Pacific region that are held by actors other than Japan, perhaps the sort of less expansive ones, how do they affect the foreign and development policies of these various actors who are players in that super regional space? So 5 minutes to reflect on those two issues, and then we'll conclude.
Sure. Thanks, Ville, and thanks also to the audience members for submitting these questions. In terms of comparing multi-layered connectivity with other countries' approaches, I think this is a bit challenging because, as I had mentioned before, in a way, multi-connectivity is nothing terribly new. But at the same time, within the context of Japan's FOIP, it's emphasizing certain aspects that have not been emphasized before. So you could argue it's a new take on connectivity. And this take, of course, is different in that it's focusing much more on non-tangible connectivity, soft infrastructure, one might say, human connectivity, digital connectivity. And there, I think we see a lot of synergy actually with a number of other countries' policies where we see the shift of not just focus on infrastructure or quality infrastructure, but understanding that in order to use infrastructure, in order to make any kind of outcome of acquisitions, you need to have the capacity, you need to have the know-how, you need to have the understanding. And so, of course, training and exchange and more human connectivity can lend to this, right? So going from that kind of standard cooperation to non-standard cooperation. So I think my answer there is that there is a bit of mirroring in the policies that I have also reviewed elsewhere. However, the terminology is not the same, right? They're not talking about multi-layered connectivity. It's usually talking about capacity building, and in some cases, soft infrastructure building. In terms of Japan's interpretation of the Indo-Pacific and what this means given its expansiveness, I think we have to understand that Japan's FOIP, even physically on a map, even though that's the region it focuses on, it's really only a few areas within this broader region that are in full focus. That's not to say there aren't projects that Japan will link to FOIP in South America, but really the hub and heart, again, the ASEAN region, then moving on to South Asia, then moving on to Africa. And so even though Japan's FOIP expands, you can see in that map at the beginning, or its understanding of the Indo-Pacific to include China, for instance, there's no FOIP initiatives going on in China. But I do think it's important also to note that Japan is really moving away from the idea of FOIP being a geographic concept. And this is distinct, right? This has been a vision. First, it was a strategy, then it's a vision. Now it's a mindset and a concept, a visionary concept. So I think actually the idea is to not look so much at the map that it covers and the geographic space, but to think about what it does. And this relates back to multi-layered connectivity and the values-based discussions that are so foundational to Japanese foreign policy, but also FOIP. And I think now the next step for FOIP, maybe FOIP 3.0, will be to continue honing in on this and showing us what is really different, right? What is changing from FOIP 2.0 to FOIP 3.0 when it comes to speaking about values, when it comes to reception of FOIP, which I think is an area we still are grappling with at the research level. But also when it comes to this terminology that Japan is constantly pushing, whether it's quality infrastructure, free and open Indo-Pacific, multi-layered connectivity, at the end of the day, what are the outcomes and how can we understand the growth of the Indo-Pacific in the context of these contributions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ren. Very thoughtful reflections on the connectivity strategies of a connectivity superpower, as Bart so aptly put it. Please keep your eyes peeled for information on our event in June. More will come on that in the near future, which will then conclude our broader connectivity project. I really want to thank you, Ren. It's great of you to take the time. It's great to see you virtually, and it's also going to be great to see you in Helsinki, hopefully over the summer. So thank you very much, everyone. Been a really fruitful, interesting discussion, and we are adjourned.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.